Greatest love story ever animated, says the back of the case. On my shelf, I have more unwatched anime on it than I'd like to admit. You only have so much time in the day, in a year, in your life, to watch the things that you enjoy, and keeping up with just seasonal anime in and of itself can take a toll on your time, so figuring out what great anime of yesteryear that you missed out on and should get around to can be a challenge. This show is one that I've known about for almost as long as I've been an anime fan. It aired around the same time that I started to get seriously into anime. It's a story full of adventure and some romance that I would have loved. But that's it. I think watching it now and picking up on elements that I wouldn't have back then is just as enjoyable. So as jaded as I might be, I can still identify the optimism and the hope within this show and appreciate it for what it is. Ladies, gentlemen, and others, my name is Arcada, and welcome to Glass Reflection. Today, the 2005 series, directed by Tomoki Kyoda and produced by Studio Bones, Eureka 7. Let's jam. Alright, enough with the heart-filled intro. I know too many people who love this series to death, so if I'm gonna say anything about it that's not absolute praise, which is totally what's about to happen, I need to be careful. Eureka 7 is a series that is chock full of narrative issues, somewhat arbitrary plot lines, abstract concepts that are either never fleshed out enough or just poorly explained. Largely, it's about two characters, Renton and Eureka, who meet in their adolescence, and through a combination of fate and happenstance need to come together to save the world. It's not like we've ever seen that before. The budding love between the two mates is the focus, to be sure, but those who they travel with are almost more interesting. The conflicting relationship between the older leader Holland and his girlfriend Taoho is both explosive in a bad way and heartwarming as they both come to terms with various elements in their lives. The children of Eureka, who must now deal with the fact that this outsider has been forced into the picture and they need to accept that. These relationships don't always go the way that we want them to, but that's life, and I appreciate the series for understanding that and showcasing it in the way that it does. Of course, it also showcases the characters being really freaking annoying. In the early episodes, we have Renton, who basically left home to join a group of surfers, and because this beautiful girl crashed into his house and he wants to follow her.
She's the ideal girl that doesn't think the things that I say are strange. Sure, she's a little weird, but she's so worried about having trashed my room that she wants to use a flamethrower to burn.
But Renton is, and I'm sorry if you like him a lot, one of the most annoying main characters that I have had to watch. Not the worst, thankfully, but at times he comes close. The fate of the world, everyone, rests on a kid who cries when he can't make a pass in soccer. Far too often, the relationship between him and Eureka has a wedge driven into it because of something stupid that he did unknowingly, because he doesn't know better, or other things that he does on purpose because he's too stubborn to realize the results of his actions. Granted, after the first number of episodes, it's far easier to forgive because the people that he's choosing to live with are...
Who's gonna hold all the stuff I get if you don't come with me?
...worse human beings than he is. Holland specifically is an arrogant, equally stubborn ass, but most of the members of the Gecko State have varying levels of immaturity despite their experience and ages. But that's like one of the tenets of the show though, learning to love and accept someone despite their mistakes. So even if I rolled my eyes far too often at the stupid decisions made by the cast, and I did, I can at least appreciate how human these characters are despite that. But while the show has good characters, its plot is where things sometimes fall apart. In fact, it's very easy to say exactly where things fall apart in the universe of Eureka 7. The problem with the plot is that it's the story of Renton and Eureka, but it is so much so that we don't get necessary details or fleshing out of elements that don't directly involve them as a pair. At first, I thought so much of the unexplained was done on purpose. But then the adult characters pull info dumps out of their ass at convenient moments, despite apparently knowing this information the entire time that would have helped push things along. And that's bad enough. But even those dumps are missing things. Events that happened before the series are left mostly vague. The narrative has a habit of hiding things until opportune moments. Like Eureka having met and learned a lot from Renton's father, who he hasn't seen in years. The things that happened between Eureka and Holland take almost forever to surface, and even then I'd argue that their origin gets mostly forgotten about as the show starts to drive itself towards some semblance of a narrative conclusion. I say semblance because its ending has a lot of hiccups and narrative decisions that I question, mostly along the lines of the previously mentioned concepts that are introduced, but not explained. Plus the romance near the end, while touching at the very end, has many large moments that make it seem more like a soap opera, with decisions made because we need to fill up time and add conflict for the sake of conflict, despite us dealing with similar issues already. And don't get me started on the show's villain. He's just so ridiculously stupid. He might as well star in his own James Bond film for the amount of times that he could have ended the heroes right then and there, but then let them get away, all the while saying, "What can they do anyways?" Really, dude? But it's okay because he has a Deus Ex Machina way to win in the end, and something that comes out of nowhere, so huzzah! Good for you, buddy. And hey, for good measure, let's start to get the show's finale all set up, get everybody pumped and ready to go, and then have a soccer episode for no goddamn reason. This episode is almost as out there and unnecessary to the plot as that one game show episode of Ergo Proxy, and oh, would you look at that, they have the same lead writer. Shocking. But since we brought up Ergo Proxy, it's worth also mentioning that Eureka 7 has the benefit of being far more accessible than other shows that like to explore similar themes. It's not as dark and mysterious as Ergo. It's not as narratively convoluted as Noeen. The aspects of the show that fall under traditional shonen archetypes are also what help to make the show more appealing. Well, that and also the series is visually appealing, which was something that was somewhat nostalgic for me. Like, as I mentioned, this was my first time going through the series, so to rewatch animation that was made by Bones in the mid-2000s was a real treat. There were many a time where I could see the similarities in the animation to the original Fullmetal Alchemist, and as the show progressed, I could see where eventually Bones would end up going with Soul Eater. The kind of fluid animation for the show's action in the second half, and the emotions that the characters' faces are able to hold. The expressions themselves might be a result of the character designer, Kenichi Yoshida, who previous to Eureka 7 helped on a number of works for Bones, but even before that, he was an employee at Ghibli, with Yoshida being an animator on Ghibli works like Mononoke, Only Yesterday, and Whisper of a Heart. It's not hard to see where this might have come from. But he is not the only recognizable name attached to this series. The mecha designer for the show, responsible for things like the famous Nirvash, is Shoji Kawamori, who, if you've never heard of him before, is more or less the king of mechs that transform, as he was responsible for virtually every transformable mech in the Macross series, as well as the designs for a lineup of toys that would eventually be brought by Hasbro in the 1980s and called Transformers. And even they are not the only famous names, as episode 18 of the series, Opposite View, had the combined efforts of two of my favorite creative minds in anime. This episode had a script by Chiaki Kanada of Lane and Ghost Hound fame, alongside Sayo Yamamoto, director of Fujiko Mine, Michiko and Hatchin, and more recently, Yuri on Ice. While the episode itself wasn't extremely noteworthy as far as the plot went, the progression and design was quite different from the ones previous to it. It was a lot more trippy and psychological than what was shown up to that point. Not surprising, since both Kanaka and Yamamoto worked together before on Technolize briefly, and that's one of the most psychologically driven mind trips to ever be released. Oddly enough, the things that I had the most problem with were the show's opening and ending sequences. Usually, these sequences are the most well-produced parts of a show, with animation that far exceeds the average of what the production is usually capable of, but in this case, I never found them to be fitting. For the endings especially, I always found it rather disjointing when you had a very emotional scene to end an episode with, and swapping into an upbeat pop music outro for the ED? It just never gelled well. And the show's third opening was like the worst. Like, it's not the worst of any anime opening that I've ever seen before. I'll get to that one of these days. But with animation that looks like it was missing keyframes in places, to the music that didn't give the feeling of what the show was about at all, it was something that just made me feel like I couldn't hit the skip button fast enough. The music especially was disappointing on that front, as the score for the rest of the show was so good in comparison. The influence of music was evident throughout the narrative. Heck, when more or less every episode title was a take on some piece of music or another, you know that there's some importance there. The last thing sound-wise to mention would of course be the dub. Now, both the English dub and the Japanese dub had their own pluses and minuses, but mostly it just makes me wish that there was some option to pick and choose performances across languages and just have a mixed language dub if I so wanted one. Johnny Young Bosch's Renton really rubbed me the wrong way.
The city just sucks!
Like, I've heard him do this exact same voice before, but it's usually for when a character has a childhood flashback. And I've dealt with it then because it wasn't the main voice that he used. But with Renton's whiny attitude, it just made it extra cringy for me, so I much preferred Yoko Sanpei's take on the character. Conversely, though, I wasn't much of a fan of Keiji Fujiwara's Holland in the Japanese, and much preferred the tone taken by Crispin Freeman in the English dub.
Don't beg for things. Do it yourself, or else you won't get anything.
As much as I wish that I watched Eureka 7 a while back, when it would have helped a younger me deal with a world that isn't really fair, I think in the years to come, I will remember Eureka 7 fondly, more so because of the things that it's able to do right, despite its flaws. Which I think is one of the things that this show tries to teach us. Eureka 7 tackles many topics that other shows either don't like bothering with or handle in less obvious ways. The importance of family, the power of the media, and unchecked power that could kill us while we praise those doing the killing. It's a flawed series that I think people end up liking because it's flawed, rather than some pinnacle of storytelling. And honestly, I love it for the same reasons. Are there things that I wish it did differently? Yes, of course. Heck, had I actually watched the series when it aired, I probably would have used it as a staple answer anytime asked me what kind of shows I'd like to see remade, a la Brotherhood. Though now that such a thing is actually happening, I'm not sure I want it. The series could have used some tightening up, better planning here, more focus there, yeah, but ultimately I think that the story is done, and I don't really want to rehash. Expand on the existing story, sure, that could be a welcome addition, but leave the story of Eureka and Renton where it lies, with all of its blemishes intact. Because hey, if you try to cover all of that up, it might end up looking worse than when you started.
You have reached my heart in many ways. 伸ばしたその手の One day we'll see we're meant to be ほんの少し先に Glory Day.
And that's it for me. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope you enjoyed it. As always, I want to thank my patrons for supporting these videos, as without them, they would not be possible. More specifically though, I would like to thank Hedril Leon, Bing Theo, Robert Chumzai, Calhoun Boy, Sid Yamiko, Victor Ekmark, and Joshua Garcia for being especially awesome. And until next time, ladies, gentlemen, and others, stay frosty. Seriously though, fuck that soccer episode. Just no.